am a creature of habit. I oftentimes do the same things in the same way. I enjoy the stability of a routine and the discipline behind a committed practice. One of my routine activities is running. I'm not a competitive runner. I'm slow. I always take the same route in the Coconino National Forest near my neighborhood. Many of us run, so it's a common place to start. Running has a rhythm and a pattern. I don't wear headphones, so it's quiet. So it's the routine of the run that sometimes gives way to my imagination. And getting to know the same landscape intimately illuminates even the slightest changes and renews the experience. I'm here to talk with you about how observational practice, transformed through the art of drawing, can be an invitation for contemplation, a call to action, and perhaps a catalyst for change. So it was on a routine run last October that I observed that the landscape had changed. It oftentimes changes with the seasons. But on this particular instance was the morning after a violent windstorm had blown through the forest, swept through Flagstaff, cutting power, ripping off shingles, and along my run, uprooting trees. Quite literally, tree after tree. It was like expired Christmas trees littered at the curbside, except for these were majestic ponderosa pines. And uprooted, I could see the wisdom of the root system, wide-spreading with a deep taproot, which typically makes these trees adaptable to high elevation, dry conditions, and usually wind. So I wondered, what could further ungrounding these trees say through the context of art? Not only about this disrupted landscape, but about this particular moment in time. The way I approach my art isn't all that different than how a scientist approaches an experiment. The art method is in many ways like the scientific method. We both start with a deep sense of curiosity, observing patterns, asking questions, making predictions. These may sound familiar as the first steps of the scientific method. Then, gathering data, analyzing data, drawing conclusions. The methods aren't parallel, but rather a departure point. I'm not trying to prove a hypothesis through my artwork, but rather open the questions to the range of possibilities. This is about ways of knowing. And so, the following week, I returned to my running route with my camera and photographed every downed tree along the trail. It was important to me to capture this moment in time. The storm had just happened. The pine needles were still green and intact, the damp soil and rocks still clinging to the roots. I photographed from low vantage points and steep angles, sometimes obscuring the treetops in order to further emphasize the roots. These photographs became the data, if you will, that I took back with me to my studio. As photographs, they served exclusively as documentation and as references. The art would happen for me through drawing. Drawing is itself observational practice. It requires focused observation and critical investigation. In the act of drawing, as the eye carefully, slowly travels the subject, so the hand follows in a coordinated act, making marks on the page. My aim is to capture the specificity of a subject, its personality, which is different than scientific illustration, which is concerned with capturing generalities for the important purpose of identification. While I'm drawing, I'm simultaneously thinking about aesthetics and also the variety of meaning and interpretation that a given piece can have. Looking and re-looking, drawing and redrawing. I often work in series, so I'm working and reworking the same subject matter over and over again. In retrospect, these drawings represent the turbulent fall season of 2020, the same season as the windstorm, which was shrouded in a global health emergency, the climate crisis, political upheaval, and civil unrest. Ponderosa pines are typically resilient to the harshest conditions. What circumstances can destabilize even the strongest stature? Ashes to Ashes is a series of drawings representing recent Arizona wildfires from 1990 to the present. These drawings are rendered using collected charcoal from the wildfire sites statewide. This series of drawings came out of the Arts and Collaboration Fires of Change here at Coconino Center for the Arts. Those of you here with a connection to science understand the importance and necessity of regular wildfire cycles for the longevity and health of the ecosystem. Wildfire, however, is accompanied by negative public perception with forest devastation and human disaster. The objective of these drawings is to reverse the public perception trajectory as viewers gain a renewed appreciation for the importance of wildfire in our shared landscape. The severity and frequency of recent fires, of course, is due to suppression systems that started over a century ago, along with increased drought and warming due to climate change. Visiting the wildfire sites to collect the charcoal provided a firsthand experience with the place. For the viewer, just knowing that the material used to create the art is the ashes of the perceived disaster of the place evokes a visceral experience and an emotional response. This is the Dosi Fire of 2013. This fire occurred within a mile of my home and studio bordering the Prescott National Forest at the time. This is the Yarnell Hill Fire. 2 weeks after successfully fighting the Dosi Fire, 19 members of the Granite Mountain hotshot crew were fatally killed in the Yarnell Hill Fire. Individuals and communities that have experienced loss of property and loss of life bear an especially emotional response to wildfire. While I was working on this project, I was invited on a guided hike with a small group of scientists and educators in the recent burn area of the Dosi Fire on Granite Mountain. I remember the day. It was quite warm, bright blue skies, walking through chaparral amongst granite boulders. I remember walking behind my colleague, Bob Ellis, and at one point on the hike, Bob turned and looked at me, and he said, "What do you see when you look at that tree?" I remember the tree. It was quite tall, the trunk wide and gnarled. The tree was divided vertically, half silver from the sunlight bleaching the weathered wood, the other half charred into deep crevices, the deepest black. Some of the branches still bore needles, the others were bare. So I described the tree to Bob, as I am to you now, visually. Then I asked Bob, "What do you see?" And Bob said, quickly, confidently, "Juniperus depiana." Of course, alligator juniper. In the moment, I felt like I'd given the wrong answer, or a non-answer. But of course, I hadn't been invited on that hike to identify trees, and Bob hadn't expected my response to match his botanical expertise. But still, after all these years, I kind of wondered. So in preparing for this talk, I reconnected with Bob in an email, and I asked him, "Do you remember that day?" And he replied, "Yes, I remember that day. I remember that day because I remember asking you that question." And he continued, "I didn't ask anyone else on that hike what they saw. And what I remember of your response was quite satisfying to me. You showed me something that I could not see. It was worth knowing. Yes, I remember that day." Those of us on that hike shared similar interests and curiosities, but took away quite different meanings. Knowledge is provisional. The standards on which it is based change and shift over time. The Catalina Rincon Panorama is a project that came out of a research collaboration with the University of Arizona Laboratory of Tree Ring Research. Again, it is rendered using wildfire samples that were collected across significant recent wildfire sites in the Catalina and Rincon Mountains outside of Tucson. The Catalina Mountain is Tucson's most prominent range, with a peak at Mount Lemmon, the highest in the Sky Islands. It's inhabited at Sabino Canyon and Summer Haven. The vegetation ranges from saguaro cactuses to alpine forests. Because it is inhabited, wildfire must be suppressed. The vegetation is dense and the mountain appears green. The Rincon Mountains, on the other hand, peak about 700 feet lower, the vegetation ranging from chaparral to ponderosa pines. Because it is uninhabited, naturally occurring wildfire is typically allowed to run its course. The vegetation is thinned in natural occurring wildfires, and it appears brown. Herein lies the disparity on which the drawing is based. From a bystander's perspective, the Catalina Mountain appears the healthier of the two mountains, whereas in reality, the Rincon Mountain is the more sustainable environment. Which brings me to my last example, migration. Last September, hundreds of thousands of migratory birds were found dead across the Southwest. These unprecedented mass mortalities were attributed to the catastrophic wildfires that decimated so much of the Western landscape, causing birds to flee before they'd replenished their fuel reserves. Scientists are particularly interested in these events because bird migration is a pattern, and changes in behavior and route are indicators of climate events. I was fascinated because metaphorically, these events illuminated the disparities inherent in human migration and climate gentrification. And this is what I wanted to explore in this art installation. Humans, like birds, rely on resiliency and are threatened by vulnerability in the face of climate change. Those facing socioeconomic inequality, including Black, Latino, and Indigenous communities, oftentimes live in locations exposed to the greatest environmental hazards. The title, White Flight, refers to the notion that in the United States, climate gentrification is typically available to those with the means and mobility to relocate to more desirable geographic locations. Flagstaff is one of these locations. Displaced communities become less diverse and increasingly segregated, which raises the question, who gets left behind, and what inequities do we condone to ensure our own reserves? In the installation, an animated charcoal drawing of a flock of migratory birds soars across the white walls of an enclosed space. Periodically, at random, a bird drops out of the picture plane, while others soar beyond the frame above. Intermittent scenes of rising floodwater and blazing wildfire emerge and fade. I made these drawings using, again, wildfire charcoal collected, this time from Flagstaff's recent museum fire. The bird animation is a single-page drawing, so the marks and erasures of the drawing process show in the animation, projected into the space. Drawing and redrawing, erasing and re-erasing, photographing and re-photographing, stitched together and put into motion, these create the animation. An accompanying sound component by sound artist and collaborator Rebecca Gates provides a complementary oral image of birds and human migration. Comprised of sonic samples and oral histories, it provides a full sensory experience for the installation. The floor of the installation is covered in a fine layer of wildfire ash, the sediment that flows downstream during the monsoon rains. A boardwalk of charred planks allows the viewer to enter the space, becoming physically implicated in the content. Collected deceased birds, dried and coated in wildfire ash, are suspended in the space. Again, the material used to create the art bears significance. It is from this place, asking the viewer to consider their own role and action in climate change's patterns. Art and science are both steeped in curiosity. Artists and scientists both share common interests, but express them differently. My work, whether uprooted trees, burning forest, the migration of birds, however fleeting, is an opportunity for a visceral experience and emotional response. So next time you're in nature, I invite you to join me in looking closely, patiently observing, asking big questions, becoming informed, and perhaps drawing conclusions. Thank you.
I can tell that you guys had kind of the same reaction I had the first time I watched it. By the way, we practice a lot. You can ask any of the speakers here. A lot of the festival events, we ask the speaker to come, they present, everyone's happy. But the side talks, we practice. And I think you guys can see the results of that. So another round of applause, please. So I have two things to bring up. First, even though I've seen the birds now multiple times on our Zoom screens when we're talking to each other, it's kind of breathtaking. You know, when you're thinking about, we know climate change is dangerous. We know the fires are dangerous, but you don't always realize the far-flung implications, such as a bird not being able to complete migration and falling from the sky. So your work like yours, I think, is amazing and really helps communicate a serious problem. So that, I want to say thank you. Thank you. But I do have a question for you.
Okay.
One thing I kind of find surprising about your work, and I am not an art critic, so maybe this is I should not be surprised, is that you have such a mix of something natural, like the charcoal or the birds or the boardwalk, but at the same time, you rely heavily on technology with the videography, using your drawings to create something. Is there more you can tell me about that? Like, why do you have that mix? Is that something normal, something that you find to be really evocative, personally?
Yeah, thanks, Brandon. Sure. So the use of charcoal and collected charcoal in particular goes back to the earliest Paleolithic cave paintings. It's carbon. It remains as an element at fire sites even when the vegetation regrows. So I think on some level in contemporary art there's a nod to the history based on the material you're using, and that's surely part of this. I'm much more interested about that is a piece of the place that comes into the art. In contrast to how we're introduced to a lot of art currently, which is digitally, which is then coded, which is obviously the case even seeing the artwork through representation. We're not having that firsthand experience. So what my interest is using the material that comes out of a history of representation, yet taking it beyond representation alone, bringing an element of the place, trying to further share that place through the visceral experience that comes from knowing deeply that material.
All right, thank you.
Yeah,
Tell you put a lot of work into that.
Thank you.
Another round of applause, please. Well done.
Thanks, Brandon.